Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Global Health Impact Network podcast. I'm normally your host, Martin Eels, but today we have a very special host who's going to be hosting today's session. He is one of the founding principals for Global Health Impact Fund and the Global Health Impact Network. I would like to introduce you all to Bob Sweeney. Bob, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Martin. I'm Bob Sweeney. As Martin pointed out, I'm one of the founders of the Global Health Impact Fund and Network. Prior to that, I spent nearly 40 years in management, and we're running the promotions department of growth companies in healthcare, four of them specifically. And one of those went public twice, Team Health. Then I spent nearly 20 years as the CEO of Challenger Corporation, where I met Dan, who was the founder. We'll talk about him in a moment. Prior to being in business, I had about 10 years in academics. I was lucky enough to gain my doctorate at Carnegie Mellon University and to have postdocs at MIT and Dartmouth. So I met people a lot smarter than me and learned things along the way, but decided to get into management because I could make a better income that way, frankly. And it turned out well. It was a good choice. Anyway, a few years ago, I decided to step away from being a manager to become a principal in a venture capital fund. That also has worked out well. We've created a niche fund for investment in digital health, and we've created a network that permits us to evaluate investment prospects and to interconnect physicians and other clinical personnel with common interests. Dan is one of those people. Dan, I'm going to let you tell your own story and get off to a brief start here. And then after you've done that, I'll come back and have some questions for you for the audience.
Sure. I'm Dan Jones, CEO and Chief Medical Officer of Eureka Clinical Computing. I have an extensive background, both clinically and in technology for healthcare. My initial aspirations happened back in the 80s in my first year of medical school, when I realized that one day in the library that the amount of medical information that's now available that's useful and should be applied to the diagnostic process simply exceeds the ability of physicians to remember and apply. So I resolved to apply AI to the problem of general medical diagnosis. But at that time, the hardware and software just wasn't up to the task. So I had to sort of put that on the back burner for a few decades, it turned out. In the meantime, I was boarded in emergency medicine, practiced emergency medicine for 15 years. Then I opened my own clinic in urgent care and family medicine, where I practiced 11 years. And also during that time, I did numerous technology innovations in healthcare. In the 80s, I did experimentation with neural networks for medical diagnosis. In 1990, I founded Challenger Corporation, one of the first companies to provide online continuing education and boards preparation products for clinicians. Also at Challenger in the early 90s, you may recall, Bob, you and I developed a neural network for diagnosis of appendicitis, which was marketed for several years. Then at my clinic in Eureka Springs in the 2000s, I developed a tablet check-in app for patients so that they could use natural handwriting recognition to enter their complete history and all the medical information that you would normally get on paper forms directly into the EMR, and that saved both the nurses and doctors considerable documentation time and enhanced our documentation. So I've had considerable experience doing those sorts of things. And then in 2000, my wife, Alicia, who's a PhD in electrical engineering, and I realized that the combination of the hardware, software, and internet capabilities had at that time progressed to the point where we could actually deliver real-time AI general medical diagnostic assistance. So we sold our clinic and founded Eureka Clinical Computing, where over the past several years now, we have developed Midas Med, a general medical diagnostic aid for clinicians.
So, Dan, you mentioned in your review there, a pretty impressive one, by the way,
Thank you.
AI in general. I guess I'd like to have, since you've been there from the beginning, more or less, Give us your impression of how AI has changed in healthcare, its function there, how effective it is, the kinds of things that you've seen that we should recognize as part of understanding the role of AI in healthcare.
Yeah, sure. The current status is promising but limited. At this point, we've seen over the last few years several focused AI applications that are rather narrowly focused on specific findings or patient problems, including apps to diagnose photographs of skin lesions, chest x-rays, mammograms, retinograms, EKGs. And in general, the more recent of these applications are performing as well or better than clinicians. So I think we'll continue to see progress in this area and increasing acceptance of these applications in the clinical settings. The holy grail, of course, and what I've aspired to do all these decades, is AI for general medical diagnosis. And by that, I mean an AI that, like a good doctor, can diagnose disorders, the entire spectrum of disorders in all organ systems, and do that based on the complete patient data, including the history findings, examinations, tests, and so forth. And to do that more quickly, more accurately, and more efficiently than docs can do that without the AI assistant. We now have the technology to do that. We've developed the technology to do that here at Eureka Clinical with our MitusMed application, but we still have several tall hurdles to implementation in the workflow. The first hurdle that we have to get over is the data acquisition problem. We've seen several companies in the past few years attempt to solve this problem by applying machine learning to EMR data. And so far that has failed and probably will for the foreseeable future due to limitations in EMR data. The fundamental limitation is that EMRs were never designed, intended, or used to describe diseases, but only to document and support patient care. And so fundamentally, all the information you need for diagnosis isn't there. And the second major problem with EMR data is that it's heavily contaminated with financial and medical, legal, or malpractice considerations. For instance, you may have noticed just in the past few days, we've seen news items saying that several of the top Medicare Advantage plans are being investigated for upcoding their diagnoses to reflect a more severe status of the patient's disorder than they actually had in order to get increased compensation. So basically, automated collection of the data is not yet possible. And what's required is a very labor-intensive data collection by a team of data scientists and clinical experts to do the collecting, organizing, and pre-processing of medical data so that it's suitable for consumption by a medical AI. The second main problem that we were encountering is the problem of workflow integration. To be accepted by clinicians, an AI diagnostic assistant has to be embedded in the workflow where it's accessible by both the patients, the nurses, and the doctors or clinicians. And this has to happen seamlessly without slowing people down and, of course, increase the overall efficiency of the process. This is very problematic, however, because all the existing EMRs we have now, including the several major ones that have the lion's share of the market and dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller EMR vendors, they all developed gradually over several decades prior to the existence of any EMR data standards. So it's very difficult to get the various EMRs talking to each other or accepting a clinical workflow product such as MitusMed. However, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of the HL7 FHIR interoperability standard as a data standard that is solving this problem. So we expect this problem to be solved in the next few years. The third major hurdle that we face here is physician acceptance or buy-in. And the main issue there is physicians are suspicious of any more software added to their workflow for good reasons. The EMRs have substantially increased their documentation burden while bombarding them all day with mostly unhelpful alerts. Also, in the past decades, we've had several products that claim to be general medical diagnostic assistants, such as QMR, Iliad, DXplane, let's see, Isabel, Visual DX. But these have not lived up to their promise. They simply emerged prior to the time when the technology was had matured to the point to be able to solve this problem. But despite these hurdles, I'm convinced that AI, general diagnostic assistants, will be embedded in the workflow of most physicians within the next 5 or 10 years. The potential gains from increased accuracy, speed, and efficiency of diagnosis are simply too great to be ignored. I think that 10 years from now, no physician will be practicing without AI diagnostic assistants any more than today an accountant or an engineer, say, can practice without QuickBooks or AutoCAD.
Well, that's all pretty interesting. You've one of the things you've done is you've looked at some of these companies more carefully. I read an article that you and Alicia wrote recently. I think it's out for publication, where you did a comparative analysis of your program and 4 or 5 others that were available for physicians if they wanted to use them. So give us a brief perspective on what the comparative advantages and disadvantages are and what they tell us about the current state of AI.
Sure. We've seen 2 trends over the last decade or so, including the emergence of and improvement of pre-existing general medical diagnostic tools for clinicians on the one hand, and quote unquote symptom checkers for patients on the other hand. So what we did, we felt like we had accomplished some of the major goals of general AI diagnosis that other people had not yet solved. So we did a comparison study where we compared MidasMed to 6 other online diagnostic assistants for both professionals and patients, and 3 physicians. We used a set of 30 case study vignettes, which had been used in previously published studies. And what we found was that the physicians scored about 75% getting the correct diagnosis. And by that, I mean having the correct diagnosis be at the top of their differential diagnosis list based on just sparse patient history findings. We found that the best diagnostic assistants, they ranged in performance from 67 to 73% correct diagnosis, whereas MidasMed attained 93% of the correct diagnosis. So we feel like, we're convinced that we have a superior product here to solve this problem, and we're now applying for an NIH grant to be able to test on a larger set of disorders and a larger number of users, including additional clinicians in more realistic settings. And we hope to have that data within the next year or so to prove that our technology is what we claim.
And in doing so, I mean, you've got a substantial audience here for our conversation. I'm just guessing that you might appreciate some interest or even participation from similarly interested or qualified clinical people who want to try to get involved with this topic.
We definitely would. We, at this point, are interested in collaborating in several different ways. Number one, in acquiring relationships with clinicians and data scientists who would like to participate in the data collection process to help fully populate our diagnostic AI. We also are looking for clinical evaluators in terms of physicians who would like to incorporate and test our diagnostic AI for the time being until we have the complete set of disorders in there. It would be for focused patient problems. And we're also looking for vendors of EMRs and online workflow software, which is proliferating at this point, including telehealth vendors, people like that, to embed our MidasMed product in the clinical workflow. So there's several areas in which we're seeking collaborators.
That's very interesting. And we'll have your contact information available at the end of this conversation. Good. So let me switch topics here for just a second. One of the things that you've agreed to become involved with is heading up or coordinating our Committee on Diagnostic Innovations in the Global Health Impact Network. Global Health Impact Network is a kind of agnostic system. That means it doesn't have to be wedded to anything done by the fund company we work with, but
Yeah.
it's an agnostic company to help clinicians share information and collaborate on projects of one kind or another. And given your background and my personal knowledge of you, a few months ago, we asked you if you would be willing to chair or coordinate our Diagnostic Innovations Committee, and we've just been setting that community up. And I'd like to know what your aspirations might be for that space, or what your thoughts are about it. I know what ours are, but I'd like to hear from you.
Sure, Bob. I would like to see it as a space for various interested parties, including both physician potential users of AI for diagnosis, and various vendors that might be interested in incorporating AI for diagnosis software into their products. I think what I see the diagnostic innovations community um, performing in terms of helping members of the community is several ways. I'd like to see it as a place where clinicians can express their opinions regarding AI diagnostic software and how they can see it most quickly uh, helping them in their clinical workflow. Definitely need their input and how to progress from this point. I'd like to see it as a place where various vendors of telehealth products and EMRs and physician clinician workflow products can come to learn what's going on in this space and to express their interests in what sorts of products they think would be most readily accepted by their customers and integrated into their products. And also as a place where um, potential data collaborators could meet and express their interests or exchange ideas about ways to more efficiently collect the data that's required to support AI diagnosis.
That's pretty interesting. And while you're at it, do you have any? I don't know. Can you put your forecasting head on here for a moment and tell us over the next couple of years which applications or application areas would you imagine AI might have the most play in, and what is it about that area that lends itself to an AI type solution?
Yeah, interesting question. As I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing inroads with rather narrow focused applications. And I think the critical aspect for the sorts of products we've been working on in terms of general AI diagnostic assistance are that uh, the product has got to decrease the clinician's workload, not increase it. And one of the major ways that we can do that, and what MitusMed does, is automatically captures a detailed history directly from the patient and automatically asks the patient the appropriate follow-up questions that an expert clinician would ask to narrow down the field of possibilities. So I think that's very important. Number two, it saves the clinician time to take the history and to document the history. Of course, the clinician gets the history as recorded by the patient, and they can and will, augment it and edit it to increase the accuracy and speed and efficiency of diagnosis. An AI aid should always present uh, a probability ranked accurate differential diagnosis that's updated as each new data item is added to the net information about the patient in the record. And this is very important to reduce the probability of misdiagnosis because the most common reason for misdiagnosis is premature closure. The clinician focuses in on something that sort of matches the patient's findings without really generating a comprehensive differential and considering other possibilities that might be actually lower down in probability but need to be ruled out. So by providing that, we substantially decrease the probability of misdiagnosis. And we save the physician time in having to research to find and generate a differential diagnosis. The third way that an AI can and should help is by presenting to the clinician at all times a utility ranked list of the missing information that should be elicited in terms of additional history questions that might be asked, examinations the patient may need, or tests that might be needed to most quickly, accurately, and efficiently at lowest cost nail the final diagnosis. And those are the fundamental qualities that we have engineered into our MIDAS-MED diagnostic.
As a man who's been both a technical expert and a practicing clinician, are you concerned that the continued growth of artificial intelligence and other techniques of that kind in medicine is going to degrade the relationship with the physician personally? I mean, there's a lot of arguments and a lot of evidence that personal interaction with a physician has an impact on outcomes, a significant one.
Yeah, good question, Bob. I think that's one of the reasons why clinicians tend to resist additional software products that might actually help improve that situation, because of the way, two factors going on, one related to technology and one related to the general economics. But number one, most clinicians that I've spoken to report that having to use EMRs has increased their daily documentation time by approximately an hour on average, some of them 2 hours. And this is extra work that they generally don't have time to do during their busy appointment scheduling during the day. So it's an added burden they have to do in the evening, oftentimes before they can relax and have their dinner and be with their family or whatever. So that's one thing, that's one hurdle that we have to get over. And another one is the fact that clinicians are now pretty much, many of them, on a treadmill most of the time. They're being, in order to keep compensation up, the managed care organizations and clinics are having to schedule them with an additional appointment every 15 minutes typically, and they simply don't have time to interact with the patient the way they normally would on a more relaxed schedule. And I think patients resent this. We've noticed this, that it's not uncommon to hear patients say that, well, he didn't pay any attention to me. He was just absorbed in the computer the whole time. So what I think, how I think AI needs to resolve that problem is, for example, with the way MIDAS-MED pre-captures the patient history. That means that when the clinician encounters the patient, he already has a complete and detailed history before him. So he doesn't have to be distracted from interacting with the patient to document that or record it, and he can interact more directly with the patient. He has more time to interact with the patient because the documentation time is decreased. Other ways in which it can assist is that I know in my practice, the majority of patients who come in, they have something common, you know what it is, and the diagnosis is not an issue, but there's that 10% where you're not at all sure. They have something a little atypical, and if you don't have a magnificent memory, which most of us don't, then you need to do some research. And so you'll typically go online to one of your physician information tools like UpToDate.com or Medscape, one of those, or your online textbooks, and research that. And of course, that is a distraction from the patient interaction. And patients, again, are complaining, oh, he's just, or she's just spending most of her time on the computer. Whereas a good AI diagnostic assistant basically takes care of that research for you. It shows you at all times, you know, what the likely possible diagnoses are for this patient and what tests you need to do. So you don't have to spend that additional research time. So I think those are ways in which AI diagnostic assistants can actually improve and enhance physician-patient communication. And I think that's a function that they will serve. It may take some time to convince clinicians that they can actually do that, but I believe that's where we're going.
Do you have any sense, I was thinking about this while you were talking, do you have any sense of the extent to which medical schools and residency training programs and for that matter, nursing schools and any other clinical instructional environments are beginning to include AI and other technical processes in their instruction and teaching, and how they're doing that?
Yeah, good question. I really don't have much intuition or knowledge of that, it having been several decades since my medical school experience and training. But I do know from the more recently emerging clinicians that I've spoken with that uh, AI training and software training in during residency programs at medical school is still quite limited, and for obvious reasons, because the actual fluid, highly usable applications for the most part don't exist yet. They're just now coming online. So I think we'll see a lot of evolution there in the coming years. And I'm afraid that one problem there may be that educators may see a tool such as MidasMed Diagnostic Assistant as impeding the clinician learning in the sense of by providing too much help. And so I think that could be an issue with acceptance in the training process. But that's kind of similar to the objection that accountants shouldn't learn to use a calculator
Right.
because it does too much of their work. The problem is, humans just can't remember and apply in real time all the information we need. And we've got to get past that and move on to technology helping us.
All right. I've really appreciated this conversation, Dan. Are there other topics or subjects that I haven't hit on that you think we should? If you want to say something about them, here's a good time to do it.
Part of the problem with acceptance of AI and healthcare in general is, like most new technology, there's an initial acceptance hurdle. So I think we need to focus on, honesty in what we deliver in terms of AI, and make sure that we always attempt to underpromise and overdeliver. And I believe that if all the vendors of technology that's now being developed to assist healthcare, from the telehealth providers to the chatbot symptom checkers to applications like to the EMRs and applications like MidasMed Diagnostic Assistant. I think we all need to focus on being careful to underpromise and overdeliver, and be very conscious of how we promote and publicize these products in order to encourage public acceptance.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate all your insights and comments. Can you briefly tell us? I think you're on Central Time in the United States.
Yeah,
How's the best way for people to reach you? Is it phone or email, or what works best for you?
sure. Email is probably the best way. It's Jones, Jones, .ecc, Edward Charlie Charlie, at gmail.com. That's JONES.ECC at gmail.com. That's probably the best way to reach me. And also on our websites, eurekaclinicalcomputing.com, and on midasmed.com, the actual diagnostic aid, which is available to try out on the web now. We have contact info there, so you can reach me by those means as well. Or if you're in the Global Health Impact Network, then I can be accessed there.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate your time, and wish you best with your research projects and your various other activities. Thank you, Dan
Yeah,
Jones.
yeah. Thanks, Bob. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much, guys. That was great.